The world of geopolitics is complex. It encapsulates foreign policy, defense, trade, and culture. These can have ripples that can be felt all around the planet.
With that, we welcome you to The Global Detail, a podcast where we go beyond borders and behind the headlines to stories that impact the world.
Our goal is to peel the onion and explore the various diverse layers through riveting interviews with experts and stalwarts. I'm Akshobh Giridharadas.
And co-piloting this journey, I'm Brendan Duke. Let's get into it. Some nations are made from the tides of history crashing against the shores of geography. The state of Israel is such a nation. These waves of destiny took the form of decades of Jewish migration to the sacred land, along with the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the end of British rule in its Mandate of Palestine. Added to all this is a clash with Arab national consciousness in the same region. From Israel's inception, a constant set of threats have plagued its land and maritime borders. From the Arab-Israeli War of 1948 to the Six-Day War of 1967, and two intifadas with the Palestinian population, it has been critiqued at the UN General Assembly and in Security Council meetings. Also, the thought of a nuclear-armed Iran keeps Tel Aviv up at night. Through all this, Israel has survived to create an independent and thriving homeland for the Jewish diaspora. It's the only democracy in the Middle East with a robust tech sector and has codified the country as a startup nation, featuring Tel Aviv as a startup hub. It also boasts a sophisticated military with advanced drone technology and, of course, a forever friend and ally in the United States of America. These days, Israel is making news for other reasons. The proposed judicial reforms by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu have struck a chord of great division in the nation's populace. In response to the would-be changes to their courts, Israeli citizens have hit the streets in protest, with an estimated 6% of the country's populace speaking out against a move that would fundamentally alter the nature of Israel's government. To explain the complexity of the region, the Global Detail brought in the most authoritative voice on the Israel-Palestine conflict, Aaron David Miller. Today, he is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, focusing on U.S. foreign policy. However, he spent the better part of nearly 3 decades in the State Department as the leading voice on the Israel-Palestine conflict and Washington's Middle East policy. A tireless believer in the peace process, he served as lead negotiator and advisor to both Republican and Democrat administrations, advising various secretaries of state. For that work, he received the State Department's Distinguished, Superior, and Meritorious Honor Awards. In addition to being a diplomat, he is an author and historian whose commentaries have appeared across various international media outlets. Now, he speaks with Akshobh Giridharadas.
Given the complexities of the Middle East, this intractable conflict that we've seen, and I recall you mentioning in one of your prior conversations, quoting the famous, I think it was Mark Twain, where he says, "Proximity breeds conflict in children." And that's Israel and Palestine in some ways, that proximity. They're victims of history and geography. It's this forever war, their past and present. And, they're how do you see this right now where we are? We've been through various stalemates, but is it the forces of history that will dictate, or can diplomacy win?
That's a very good question, Dr. and thanks for having me. I think Twain's quote was that proximity breeds contempt in children. And I think there's no question. Proximity, I guess, the only positive attribute about proximity in this particular problem is that it guarantees, frankly, that there cannot be a status quo. Now, that could be interpreted as a future of conflict and violence, or alternatively, a future based on accommodation and then some conflict-ending solution. At the moment, however, I think that the prospects for what I would call a conflict-ending solution and literally a settling of the 4 or 5 core issues that drive the conflict: border security, refugees, Jerusalem, recognition of Israel as the nation state of the Jews, which is a very problematic but important requirement for Israelis, and end of conflict. Strikes me that the gap separating the current Israeli government and the current head of the Palestinian Authority are as wide as the Grand Canyon. And frankly, I don't see any prospect anytime soon of closing them. I guess I would say that Israelis and Palestinians are in what I call a strategic cul-de-sac, and I don't see any way out. In order to break this open, you need three things. And frankly, I've been arguing this since leaving government in January of 2003, 20 years now, that these three things, frankly, have been missing. They've never, frankly, been present in sufficient quantity. Number one, leaders who are masters of their politics and their ideologies, not prisoners of them. You do not have them on either side of the dividing line. Second, a sense of ownership, in which Israelis and Palestinians, for their own reasons, not because of some external pressure from an outside party, come to the realization that resolving this conflict is something that's critically important to them, a vital national interest. That's also been missing, or not present in sufficient quantities on both sides to guarantee an alignment. And finally, you need an outside mediator that was prepared not only to be reassuring, but also to be tough. And frankly, on the Israeli-Palestinian track, those three elements or ingredients, no guarantee, by the way, even if you had those three, that you could get to a complementing agreement. But if you had two of the three, if you had one of the first two, and then the third, the mediator, I think you could probably still, even at this late hour, create a serious environment for negotiation, which would test the possibility that you could, in fact, reach an accord, an equitable, durable, fair-minded agreement to meet the basic needs and requirements of each side. Right now, all of these things are not present. And you framed it quite correctly. The forces of history, which if they could speak to us, would basically say there is no solution, are competing now with the forces of diplomacy, which if they could speak to us would say, with enlightened leadership and will, you still could figure out a way forward. So those two forces, history and diplomacy, are in competition with one another, and right now history is willing out.
Yeah. You mentioned about leaders who are not victims of their own political ideology, and while I want to go deeper into the Israel-Palestine issue, I want to stick with one such example. That would be Bibi Netanyahu back again as prime minister, and Israel's no stranger to the news cycle, no victim to controversy. But this is one of the few times that, in my limited lifespan, I recall Israel being in the news controversially and nothing to do with Palestine, and that's Bibi's judicial reforms. So for a lot of people, help us interpret what are these judicial reforms. Why is Bibi in the eye of the storm, and to the point that even people like Mayor Bloomberg and President Biden have been vehement in and echoed some of their disagreements.
Yeah. First of all, terminology is important. What you call something is extremely important to trying to understand it. From the government's perspective, it's being sold as judicial reform. And it seems to me most judiciaries, including our own, are in need of judicial reform. This, however, is not judicial reform. This is what I would describe to you as a judicial revolution, because it cuts to the core not simply of altering the way judges are selected and their powers to address and to overturn, in this case, parliamentary legislation. This, if implemented, would fundamentally restructure the Israeli political system, which, as you know, unlike our system, there's no written constitution. We have one. There's no bicameral legislature with a Senate and a House, both elected. Israel does not have one. In fact, the only break on the aggrandizement of government power is an independent judiciary and the notion, the element of judicial review. I think in order to have what you and I would describe as a liberal democracy, and we can get back to the issue of why even judicial reform, quote unquote, is in fact related to both of the Palestinian issues that Israel contends with. First, the problem of out of 9.7 million humans between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, you have 2.1 million Palestinian citizens of Israel who are guaranteed equal rights under the only document that does guarantee that, which is the Declaration of Independence. And you have roughly 4.5 million Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem under varying phases of Israeli occupation. This judicial reform, should it pass, holds, I think, the direst of consequences, not just for Jewish Israelis. It holds the direst of consequences for Palestinians on both sides of the Green Line, the so-called dividing line, which separates pre-1967 Israel from post-1967 Israel. So judicial reform, revolution, coup is a major affront. Again, not just to the structure of the Israeli political system and its democracy, which I might add, Akshobh, Israel is a preferential democracy. Sadly, it is not a democracy for all of its citizens. Those Palestinian citizens of Israel suffer social and economic discrimination, in some respects, much like the United States in the 50s and up through the voting rights legislation of the 60s, when millions of African Americans were excluded both in a de facto and a de jure way, tethered to formal discrimination and de facto discrimination. We were a preferential democracy. So I think that issue of judicial review says to me, in many respects, that Israelis are going to have to sort this out. And if it comes out the wrong way, it seems to me the prospects for Palestinians living within Israel proper and those that are living under Israeli occupation, their circumstances are only going to grow more dire. And right now, Netanyahu, the prime minister, longest governing prime minister in the history of the state of Israel, surpassing David Ben-Gurion some years ago, arguably Israel's greatest prime minister, Ben-Gurion. If this is not turned back, I think you really will have a constitutional crisis, even though Israel has no formal constitution, and you could get to a place where the Supreme Court rules these changes, quote unquote, unconstitutional. Then you have state agencies, the Mossad, the Israeli Defense Forces, the Shin Bet, the career bureaucracy forced literally to choose who are they going to listen to, the court or the government.
You know, you unpacked so many things right there, particularly with Bibi now becoming the longest serving prime minister since David Ben-Gurion. And I'll get to the beginning of Ben-Gurion. But what does it mean for Israel politically? Because one of the things that we found that even for a while when Bibi was not prime minister, we had a coalition of parties with the Bennett-Lapid government, Yair Lapid and Naftali Bennett. And you found progressively since the time you've left government, Israeli politics going to the far right with the Likud party that Bibi's part of, and this coalition that Bennett and Lapid are part of that didn't last very long. Is the Knesset is one of the most diverse body of parties. I mean, similar to other constitutional parliamentary systems, unlike what we have in the US, where it's sort of a Manichaean duopoly. But given this cobbling together that we saw that didn't last too long, and Bibi pushing the aggressive agenda, one, what does this mean for Bibi's own political future? And two is, if we saw something like the Bennett and Lapid government coming, are we progressively going to see Israeli politics go more to the far right than to the one time when we had people like Yitzhak Rabin who want to change, Ehud Omar, Ehud Barak? I mean, is that a day belong to days of yore?
Yeah. Couple of things here. First of all, the average length of Israeli government since independence is 1.8 years.
Mm.
The Bennett Lapid government lasted just about a year.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a certain volatility to Israeli politics.
Yeah.
Over the last 4 years, Israel's had 5 elections.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason Israel's had 5 elections in 4 years is not because Israel is highly volatile or unstable as a democratic polity. It's because the prime minister, one Benjamin Netanyahu, on trial now for bribery, breach of trust, and fraud, 3 years now in front of a district Jerusalem court, 3 judges, no juries, 3 judges, which is why judicial reform is so important here. Needed over the last 4 years to ensure that no one else other than the prime minister leading the largest, most coherent and most salient grassroots party in Israel, the Likud, governed. We could have had governments with Likud minus Benjamin Netanyahu, or even without Likud, as you saw with Bennett and Lapid. But that situation was frustrated by a prime minister for whom his trial and how it ultimately plays out is inextricably linked to his capacity to remain in power. And I think you have a situation now where judicial reform, quote unquote, is not only pushed by Netanyahu because he sees this judicial reform as a way to find a way to neutralize or immunize himself with respect to his trial. But you have other coalition partners, including the ultra-Orthodox, who want to see the court, frankly, abolished, not reformed. But at a minimum, they want a conscription law passed that would essentially free their constituents from having to do any military service whatsoever. The religious Zionists, now one party composed of 2 smaller ones, Bezalel Smotrich, who is now, for all practical purposes, the minister in charge of annexation of the West Bank, and Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's the minister of national security, under whose power and authority subsumed border police, green police, and the Israeli civil police. They want judicial reform in order to facilitate legislation that at one point, not now, because foreign policy considerations preclude it, to formally annex and bind the 60% of the West Bank, so-called Area C, according to the Oslo process, bind that permanently to Israel proper. So you have had, for the last several decades, as you pointed out, an acceleration of the Israeli body politic to the right. This is driven by demographics. It's been driven by the fact that the natural coalition party, remember, there's never been a party in Israel that is governed alone. So you need a coalition. That means you need to bargain with like-minded parties. And the reality, Akshobh, is that the right in Israel has more natural and more coherent coalition partners than the left. The Bennett-Lapid government was a sort of a wall-to-wall government from right, center right, all the way to center left. But it didn't last very long because there was simply too much, I guess, diversity in this coalition to ensure its survival. Now you have a more coherent coalition, and if Netanyahu didn't push judicial reform, I think his government would probably endure. We don't know how long it's going to last, but much will depend on how the judicial reform issue is settled or not.
I want to take you back to obviously history itself and the current states. Israel celebrates 75 years since 48, the creation of the nation state, and David Ben-Gurion. If I, in my limited time studying history, I lived in Singapore for many years, I'd have to compare Lee Kuan Yew, Ben-Gurion, Kemal Ataturk as people who built nation states from little at all, or from the ruins, and created as viable nation states. And that thrive economically, Singapore, Israel, Turkey. Just the idea of Israel, born out of World War II and what happened to the Jewish diaspora in the camps, and the narrative to create and the Balfour Declaration, and similarly that leading up to the state of Israel. And it wasn't without its moments of vulnerability, right, from the Arab-Israeli War to the 67 Six-Day War, but since then, since the rapprochement with Egypt, Jordan, In the last 20 years, perhaps the tech boom and Israel's sophistication of tech and ag tech and drone technology, has that made Israel such a viable nation state that you've seen from Ben Gurion's vision to countries that were fundamentally not aligned with the nation state of Israel, what they call occupying Palestinian lands, have now said, in an economic world, in a world where data crosses borders faster than planes, we have to have relations with Israel.
I mean, it is really quite extraordinary, because the counter narrative to what you're suggesting, that Israel would somehow become a pariah nation if it didn't find a way to settle up with the Palestinians, has simply not been borne out. Israel celebrated last week its 75th anniversary since independence, and even though at 75 neither the borders nor the identity of the state of Israel are yet settled, which frankly for a young nation is not rare. In 1851, 75 years after our independence, neither the borders of the American Republic nor its identity were settled. In fact, in 1851, we were 9 years shy of a transformative civil war that would, according to some historians, constitute a second American Revolution and pass a framework, 13th, 14th, 15th amendments, that would allow the identity of the nation to be put on a more firmer, more equitable sort of plane. But if you look at Israel in the world and Israel in the region, Israel is better integrated into this world and even into its own region beyond the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty, the nascent Abraham Accords, better integrated in Asia, Latin America, Europe, among the great powers, with Russia, than at any time since independence. And I think to a large degree, of the 190 plus nations that sit in the UN, it's just that none of them are prepared to make the redemption of Palestine a central tenet in their foreign policy. I've been toying with the notion recently that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has become, in many respects, localized. It affects Jordan, which shares the longest, arguably least defensible border with Israel. It affects Egypt because of Gaza. And it affects Israelis and Palestinians, and depending on how it plays out, it will affect Israel's relations with its newfound partners in the Gulf. But it carries an ideological resonance, but it doesn't carry the strategic importance for the region that it once did. In fact, if you ask me what is the most likely issue to spark a major regional confrontation, which could result in plunging financial markets and rising oil prices and an actual war, it would be Iran. It would be the Palestinian issue. And I think that requires some analysis. Some of it is hard to explain, but it is clearly played to the advantage of those in Israel who believe that the Palestinian issue is manageable and localized and can somehow be accommodated without a fundamental end of conflict resolution between Israelis and Palestinians. You've got a government now in Israel, the most fundamentalist and right-wing government in Israel's history, with two ministers, Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, who believe that, in fact, both Palestinian problems, 2 million Israeli Arabs, Palestinian citizens of Israel, and 4 million plus Palestinians in West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, can somehow be persuaded to, or will have no choice but to abandon their nationalist aspirations for anything that even remotely resembles an independent sovereign state. So, my own view, and back to where we started this conversation, proximity, however, will make their objectives, I think, very painful.
Yeah,
More for Palestinians than Israelis, but for Israelis as well.
It's both the tyranny of history and geography in this case. And You touch on 2 points that I want to bring up. One is I was having a conversation with a South African minister who served in Mandela's cabinet of Indian origin, and we were discussing our trips to Israel and Palestine, respectively. And he said when he went across Area A, Area B, Area C, he says, this is eerily redolent of the Bantu sons that I remember being a young boy in. And many people have used this term, albeit sometimes pejoratively, of calling Israel an apartheid state. It's something that Israel takes a strong umbrage towards. But when you look at what's happened, as you rightly said, we're hoping that these ministers hope that Palestine would, just wave off the Palestinian identity. In some ways, are we looking like at the Benedict Anderson concept of imagined communities, imagined nation, that Palestine doesn't exist as a nation, and given if you dilute it enough, building more and more settlements, not having citizenship, it'll just exist in concept only, like Kurdistan or Somaliland or some other concept that doesn't exist? Or is that what we're looking at?
Well, it's hard for me to believe that that sort of end state would exist, in large part because I think Palestinians will do everything to avoid it. Although there are now, and some Israelis, there are now. There's a current now which argues forget the two-state solution. You're now dealing with a one-state reality. Reality is not a solution, but for the moment, you're dealing with a one-state reality. Israel controls, to a large degree, the humans that reside between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. Roughly 15 million of them. It's not a lot of people. And the transition from one-state reality to what you're suggesting, a sort of one-state solution in which Palestinians who live in the West Bank and Gaza would submit to, if not de jure, then de facto annexation. Two sets of laws, two sets of bypass roads, two different realities would in fact resemble. I don't like to use the word apartheid. It's usually a conversation ender. And, my life basically is about addition rather than subtraction, trying to get people to listen and getting them not to try to hit the delete button without listening. But there's no question that some people think that apartheid is here as a headline. It's here now. Others believe, and I think I'd belong to the latter group, that it's a trend line. And if in fact the West Bank and Jerusalem is already annexed, but if the West Bank is annexed to Israel proper, and Israeli administrative and legal authorities apply to Israeli citizens, and Palestinians are essentially relegated to a different set of institutions, laws, that yes, it would resemble South Africa. I would like to believe, and again, at 74, I realize how difficult it is. I would like to draw on another parallel from the South African experience, and that is the emergence of two leaders, Mandela and de Klerk, that through their own respective heroic efforts ended up creating a pathway out of apartheid that neither you nor I probably would have believed possible. I would like to think that you could have an Israeli and Palestinian de Klerk and Mandela. Right now, it seems pretty grim. But again, never say never. I occupy a tiny space on the planet for a very short period of time. I have two grown children. They're in their 40s. I'm not going to say never. I don't have the moral right to do that. But at the same time, I also have to look at the reality without blinders. And right now, I see no way out. And the longer the no way out sort of scenario applies, the greater the chances that you're going to end up with the situation that you described.
I think it's really profound because in some of my writings, I've compared Mandela and Mugabe, two different people from who had some sort of similarity of being African leaders who could have taken a movement. And just like Mandela and de Klerk, you've also seen MLK needed an LBJ with the civil rights. And we've touched on how Israeli politics has gone to the far right. And in one of my visits in 2018, and when I visited the Palestinian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I think that time the Assistant Minister for European Affairs had said that there was a lot of umbrage with, says, how the Saudis went about, had BB and MBS had several meetings, and how basically the erstwhile Arab League or the GCC had jettisoned the Palestinian cause, given one, the elephant in the room was Iran, that both Israel and Saudi Arabia see as an antagonist, and two is just the economic heft of Israel that brought about things like the Abraham Accords, which perhaps bring me to this question. One is the Trump administration probably didn't have a lot of foreign policy successes. Could you count the Abraham Accords as one of them? And why was the Overton window there for the Emiratis and the Bahrainians to now publicly say, you know what, let's codify this relationship with Israel?
Yeah, I mean, I think Trump administration, to some degree, was pushing on an open door. Several factors had emerged in the last decade that made the situation ripe for formalization of relations that had been brewing. One, as you pointed out, was the emergence of a rising Iran. And remember, geography and proximity is critical here. 150 miles of Persian Gulf water separated a much more powerful Iran from a much weaker Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the UAE. So that was one. Second, I think there was a growing frustration with the Palestinian issue. That Palestinian national movement was hopelessly divided. It was not going to reunify after 2007 when Hamas seized control of Palestinian Authority government in Gaza. And a third factor was relations with the United States. That key Arab states saw or borrowed a page out of Anwar Sadat's book that the road to Washington lay through Jerusalem. So the combination of these three factors and the reality that for key Gulf states, which had maintained well before the Abraham Accords were signed in 2020, a web of relationships with Israel on the security and intelligence side. And as you seem to infer, when an Israeli prime minister at some point in the future sits down with the putative future king of Saudi Arabia, it will not be the first time. So you had it was like an iceberg. A quarter of the iceberg was above the waterline. Most of the mass was below, and I think Gulf states began to see that Israel had stuff that they wanted and could be a useful partner. So the Trump administration, with a sort of natural bias against the Palestinian issue, I had been asked by Mr. Kushner at least twice to come and talk to them about my experiences or our experiences in previous administrations. It's quite clear to me that he was much more focused on the Gulf states as a strategic priority, much more focused on what I would call the 22-state solution, 22 members of the Arab League, than he was the two-state solution. So not to take credit away from them, I think they deserve credit for single-mindedly pursuing these relationships. But at the same time, they did enormous damage, which was gratuitous, but politically important, by essentially waging a political and economic war against the Palestinians. But again, you ended up with these relationships, particularly between Israel and the Emirates, which are extraordinary. I call them out of conflict zone agreements. And the paradox is the fact that they were out of conflict zone agreements, that is to say, agreements between two states that were never at war with one another in the sense that they suffered terrible traumatic loss, allowed the acceleration of normalization, which have which has outpaced both the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaties and the Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty. And it's logical because Jordan and Egypt engaged in major confrontations and conflicts with Israel, and the politics in each state reflect that. In authoritarian, autocratic states, where the ruler essentially has tremendous discretion to do what he wants, there was less domestic opposition to accelerating these agreements with the Israelis. And I think that's directly related to how the politics of Jordan and Egypt were fundamentally different on Israel than the politics of Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and Bahrain.
Given without the Abraham Accords, there would be no I2U2, which of course is Israel, India, United States, UAE. A lot of people look at it as a West Asia Quad, which perhaps brings to question two things. One is, the elephant in the room is the dragon. That is obviously China with its strategic partnership with Iran through the Belt and Road Initiative, its involvement in Syria, which of course is a neighbor to Israel. One is, where does this current Israeli dispensation see its relationship with China? And two is it sort of closer ties between Washington, to these minilaterals that Washington sees important to preclude a Beijing hegemony in West Asia? Is that sort of where even Jerusalem sees
I don't think
I2U2?
that's. I'm not sure the China factor is as seminal in the Israeli calculation on either the Abraham Accords or the I2U2. It is clearly, I think, and remember this was done in 2021, which was 2 years before China did its own diplomacy with Iran and Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
And well before MBS's relationship with Vladimir Putin began to mature. I think the Israelis looked at this, frankly, as much more in a regional context along the issue of normalization of relations, a way to break out of their isolation, a way to create functional cooperation. The Israelis have a lot to give certainly on the defense side, but also high tech and on the agricultural side, to both the UAE and India. So I think they saw it, and Israel's relationship with China has grown and developed as well. But the Americans, in many respects, over the last several years, have made it unmistakably clear to the Israelis that they do not favor, in certain areas, certainly when it comes to security and technology, a growing Israeli-Chinese partnership. On the Abraham Accords and I2U2, I think, though, that it was more Israel's desire for normalization. In many respects, this current government, which claimed that it also midwifed the Abraham Accords, it was a question of sort of bypassing the Palestinian issue and basically validating the notion, you see, we can make peace with the Arabs and even with India without having to deal with the Palestinians. So I much more focused, I think, for the U.S. on the China factor than for Israel.
From your many years in government, you've seen various administrations, from the Carter administration and Camp David to Bill Clinton and the Oslo Accords. Successive Democrat and Republican administrations have, one, unwaveringly looked at Israel as an ally, given the security concerns and the Middle East being a threat and the tinderbox that it is. But did the Trump administration walk away from both Democrat and Republican policy or American foreign policy by moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem? Because that sort of said 67 is done. And Romney alluded to it when he was a Republican candidate in 2012, but did the Overton window really shift?
I work for Republicans and Democrats, and I voted for Republicans and Democrats. The Trump administration, first of all, the Republican Party has fundamentally changed. And it is now, it seems to me, with a little prospect of altering its character, very much the party of Donald Trump. And that meant, at least when it came to Jerusalem, that the Trump administration's policies on most Middle Eastern issues were subordinated to Trump's personal vanity and his domestic politics. The Jerusalem decision was undertaken in large part, I believe, because Trump wanted the moniker of being the most pro-Israeli president ever. And he also wanted to secure and gain favor in the eyes of millions of evangelical Christians who, frankly, are much more unanimity on the part of evangelical Christians toward Israel than there is on the part of the 5.5 million American Jews. So I think that Trump revolutionized, it seems to me, the traditional bipartisan attitude among Democrats and certainly Republicans toward Israel, and tried to fashion the Republican Party to be the Israel right or wrong party. And he was aided in this endeavor by one Benjamin Netanyahu, who has done more to undermine the sense of bipartisanship than anyone else. Netanyahu was quoted by an interviewer saying, quote, "I speak Republican." And you saw recently Kevin McCarthy's visit, which was, again, a political act, offering an invitation to Benjamin Netanyahu to visit Washington, while his relationship with the Biden administration is, kind of on hold with respect to an invitation on the part of the president to visit. So I think you now have a situation in which the Republican Party is the go-to party on Israel right or wrong party, and you have a divided Democratic Party. There's still tremendous traditional support for Israel, but you have Democrats who not classify themselves as progressive or left-wing, willing to be more critical of Israeli policies. And you'd be hard-pressed, I think, to find many Republicans talking about judicial reform other than we should leave it alone. It's an Israeli internal matter. And many Democrats who have spoken out quite worried about what judicial reform means for Israel's the image and the reality of a democratic Israel, however preferential that democracy may be.
Yeah, I looked at the evolution of Israel and foreign policy the way I saw compared with India. Like India in 47, 48 voted against the creation of Israel because back then Mahatma Gandhi was not a fan of partition of India and could not think of partitioning the British Mandate of Palestine on religious lines. And I think he famously said the way Britain belongs to the British, Palestine belongs to Palestinians. And until then, even when Ben Gurion visited Nehru, Israel only had a consulate in Bombay. And the Overton window has moved, and partly in the psyche of the Indian right, there is a philosophy of both India and Israel being democracies in very turbulent Islamic neighborhoods, both, the narrative. And Israel's been able to tell a stronger, better narrative from its tech story, from, the Washington lobby, as we've known, with institutions like APAC and J Street and JINSA, to the point that we have to ask ourselves today that where does it go now for the Palestinian story? Because Mahmoud Abbas said that anything short of, the 67 borders would be akin to Swiss cheese. And given the settlements are larger than some cities, is it the way Theodor Herzl conceives Zionism, like a wrecking ball that would take anything in its sight? And we've touched on hesitation of history. Palestine has just been a victim of geography, because had they looked at Uganda, where the Maasai people were, they looked at somewhere else, Palestine would exist. But it's more than history. Palestine's been a victim of geography. It's where the nation state and Zionism proliferated, and it's just Palestine that just has to suffer from the consequences of that.
I mean, where it goes, there are Israelis who will tell you that 80% of the settlers could be condensed into 4% of the territory. There are Israelis who argue that separation has already occurred. You can go to parts of East Jerusalem that are very different than West Jerusalem, where most Israelis live. I continue to believe, maybe it's aspirational to be sure, although I don't think it's Panglossian or naive, that the issue is not the absence of a clever sort of fix, but it's an absence of political will. It comes down in the end to the issue of leadership. And, Marx, writing in the 19th century, so forgive me here, he said, men make history, but rarely as they please. But the fact is, leaders still are critically important to finding a solution to this problem that avoids the one-state reality, that avoids the one-state solution, that avoids apartheid, and that it essentially would allow Israelis and Palestinians to exist as separate entities. Because maybe a confederal structure, but there is no precedent in modern history for accommodating two national movements with fundamental ethnic and religious differences, and a history of wounding and trauma under one big roof where they all live happily ever after. Geography, demography, psychology, and common sense, it seems to me, demand separation. And I think that you need leaders on both sides, and you just don't have that now. So for now, I will have to willingly suspend my disbelief, to quote Coleridge, and kind of set that aside as this very sad, tragic story plays out.
Coming to my penultimate question, cognizant of the time, a wonderful article in the Wall Street Journal by Andrew Higgins spoke about how Israel spawned Hamas, and that time was a counterweight to the PLO. Reading that article and just going into the depth of it, it just reminded me of the way the American establishment back then, Carter, Brzezinski, and Reagan, spawned the Mujahideen to fight the Soviets that became the Taliban. Is Hamas the bogeyman that the Israeli establishment and some of the Zionist movement that needs to keep this thing alive about, be it excessive, what we call violations in the Gaza Strip, continuously going? Is it the bogeyman? Because every time we talk about humanitarian issues in Gaza, it's like, but Hamas. Is that what you see continuously happening?
Hamas is the organizational embodiment of a religious brand of Palestinian nationalism. And it's not just ideological now. It's a kind of organizational imperative for this organization to survive, this movement, Hamas, to survive. It needs to differentiate itself from the Palestinian Authority. And that means maintaining the right and the reality of armed struggle.
Yeah.
And I think this is something that the notion of a three-state solution for the time being seems to me to be more likely an outcome. Hamas controlled Gaza, Palestinian Authority controlling 40% of the West Bank, and Israel controlling the rest. I don't see any, and if in fact those dynamics change, it may well change as a result of growing Hamas influence in the West Bank, because I think Hamas understands how weak, vulnerable, and credibility-less the Palestinian Authority and Mahmoud Abbas really are. So, boogeymen, regardless of what you call them, they are a reality. And final point, in fairness, we talk about Israeli settlement activity, land confiscation, targeted killing, closures. All of that is correct. But there is another reality on the Palestinian side which needs to be borne in mind, and that is the loss of the monopoly over the forces of violence within Palestinian society. A state must have, if it's going to be credible to its own citizens and its neighbors, A state must possess, a city must possess a monopoly over the forces of violence. And right now, you have a divided and dysfunctional Palestinian national movement, which frankly is the best talking point that any Israeli who is not interested in granting Palestinian rights, let alone an independent state, it is the best talking point to continue to use and rebut arguments as to why Israel cannot make this concession or that. You need ultimately, and any national movement, whether it's the FLN, the Viet Cong, any national movement will need, in order to achieve its goals, one gun, one authority, and one negotiating partner. And the Palestinian national movement right now looks like Noah's Ark. There are two of everything, two constitutions, two sets of security services, two statelets, two ideologies, two fundamentally different visions about what Palestine is and where it's supposed to be. And I don't see that breach being healed anytime soon.
It's like the why nations fail argument when you have weak institutions, and that's what has happened with the Palestinian authorities. And my final question, Brandon and I on the show love to talk about soft power, which of course Joseph Nye codified very famously, and it seems very antithetical and juxtapose hard power. But in Israel's case, there's a hard power that's merged into soft power. That is the TV shows on Netflix and Apple TV coming out, like such as Pauda and Tehran and Hit and Run. Given Israel's identity as a castle security state, that's spawned on a new genre of very thrilling mystery Bond-like Israeli thing, film industry, in the sense that in some ways Israel's having its own Korea moment where its soft power, its hard power has told a soft power story and has won fans all over. Like Pauda is such a popular show because of something of what Israel's gone through in terms of its security outlook.
Yeah, I mean, if you count culture, the arts, science, high tech, startup nation, all of that makes Israel a highly functional and gives it the power to project its image both in the region and beyond. I would argue to you, given what we've seen in the Arab world over the past 20 years, the first century historian Tacitus, Roman historian Tacitus, argued that the best day after the death of a bad emperor is always the first day. And what you've seen in the Arab Spring and the meltdown of at least 5 Arab states, Libya, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, I don't know if Lebanon, mentioned that before. You have 3 states in this region. Traditionally, Syria, Iraq, and Egypt competed for influence and power in the Arab world. Those were the 3 most potent, ideological, and powerful states.
Yeah.
They're offline now. In my judgment, it is the 3 non-Arabs, Iran, Turkey, and Israel, who, despite all their internal problems, are still the most functional states, the most powerful states in this region. They have the capacity. One is a member of NATO. One is America's closest ally in the Middle East. The other is a sort of a pariah, an outlier. Yeah. But they have, these 3 states, unlike any of the others, have the capacity to project their power beyond their borders for good and ill. They're worth watching.
That'll be all for this episode. If you like what you're hearing, tell a friend, or 2, or 3. And if you think we've earned it, give us a good rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. So, until we meet again on The Global Detail, look after yourselves. This podcast has been a production of Karkata Media in association with Perspicacity Media LLC. All guest views are their own. If you have any questions, thoughts, or concerns, email us at globaldetailpodcast@gmail.com. or you can contact us on Facebook and Twitter at Global Detail Pod. This recording, or any portion thereof, may not be reproduced or used in any manner whatsoever without the express written permission of the publisher, except for the use of brief quotations in a review. Copyright 2023 by Karkata Media LLC. All rights reserved.